Hello, everybody. It's good to see you again today. We have a little bit of a lecture to go along with our readings. We are jumping into the actual specific methods section of our course. So we've been doing some pre-work up to this point, thinking about how we behave as critics, what a text is, how to do basics of research. But now we're going to take that next step because every researcher starts by knowing what it is we analyze, what questions we can ask, and how we behave as researchers. You can think of those as meta concerns, right? These are, those of you who have taken theory, these are meta-theoretical concerns. They're thinking about, not the particular topic, but the way you go about thinking of the topic, right? So they're thoughts about your thinking. Now, though, we are jumping into the actual methods. So to equate this to science, if you were a biologist, up until this point in the class, you've been learning about the scientific method. You've been learning about how to gather samples without contaminating them. Now we're starting on how do you actually use the pipettes and the measuring instruments and the computer programs in the lab. That's the method part that we're jumping into now. And the first and most important part of understanding rhetorical criticism is that all the methods we will explore help us do three core things: describe, interpret, and evaluate texts. So that's what we're going to talk about today, those three core elements of rhetorical criticism. So there are three fundamental elements of all rhetorical criticism. Every rhetorical critic does work to describe texts, interpret those texts, and evaluate those texts. We're going to explore lots of methods on how to do these three things this year, but it's important that you start with these three basic ideas. Description is the first one. When, as a critic, you describe, you can think of yourself as fulfilling these three I will statements. I will use words to paint a picture in detail of my subject. And this is both text and context. We're going to practice this in a few minutes here. You'll also be doing the second sentence. I will draw the reader's attention to important details of my subject. And finally, I will provide evidence that can be used later to make my argument. Right? So a couple of different times during our lectures, I have described things for you in these video lectures. I've described Ferdinand the cat. I have described my credibility bookcases that exist behind me in my home and in my office. I've drawn your attention to details of that, the context of cats on the internet as a way of thinking about why Ferdinand the cat might be important, the context of the pandemic and the importance of credibility bookcases for online learning and online talking and really video anything, right? So I've drawn your attention to important details, and I've provided evidence. Right? I have used myself as demonstration. I've pointed out particular things that I then use to make a point, just as I'm doing right now. See the big circle I made there? Yeah. So that is what we do in description. We paint a picture in explicit detail that helps our readers understand what's going on. We draw their attention to important details related to our subject, and we provide evidence. The next thing that we do is interpretation. Don't think of these as individual sections of the paper. They are not individual sections of the paper. They are tasks that you as a writer undertake. And one of those tasks is interpretation. And you can think of this as another three I will sentences. I will use evidence from my description, so it has to be described first, but I will then use that evidence to show the reader how something works, right? I will describe a credibility bookcase and then talk about why it's credible given the context of the pandemic. That's interpretation. I will detail how texts and contexts work together and why it's important. So I'll show you a picture of Ferdinand the cat and describe him sitting with me a little. And I'll describe the context of cats on the internet and then tell you why those things are important, why I use the kitty cat as a way of building rapport, building connection with my students through an online medium. And then I will make arguments using evidence. And this is the same thing that you have been doing all throughout your careers as rhetoricians. You will use arguments to make evidence. All those classes in argumentation, all of those methods and theory and persuasion and public speaking classes that you've taken where we've asked you to make arguments, you're doing the same thing here. Evidence, warrants, claims and data, rebuttals, backing, all of it is part of interpretation. And then finally, a rhetorical critic also engages in evaluation. And this is where it circles back to that important part about who you are as a critic, right? If the critic is central to criticism, you have to be able to make ethical evaluations. And you can think of this as 3 more I will sentences. I will help the reader understand why my criticism matters. This isn't necessarily the end of the paper or only at the beginning. All throughout, you will be evaluating what you see. So the evidence that you present and the arguments you make, you'll evaluate those texts on why your criticism matters. I will show how this criticism contributes to theory in big or small ways. Remember, you don't have to have an entire new theory of everything. You don't have to be Albert Einstein. Sometimes it's enough to just implicate a little bit of greater understanding, to just create a little bit more knowledge and contribute to the field in that way. And then finally, I will use ethical criteria to make judgments about my text. These could be artistic standards about why in a particular culture for a particular moment, this piece of criticism had the beauty to bring people together or create a new understanding. You might use response standards. Talk about why this piece of criticism was effective. Now remember, that's a really hard claim to make because you can't just say, you know, I looked at a speech and I thought it was great, so lots of people were influenced and had emotional reactions to it. No evidence for that. There's no evidence of that reaction in the text. But if you expanded your text or context to demonstrate response standards, demonstrate that people did have a reaction, then you could make response standard evaluations. Accuracy standards are always really important. Remember that the United States is now and has always been a country where, because we value free speech, we value everybody's free speech, whether they're telling the truth or not. We as a country believe they have a right to say it. And so a big part of what rhetorical critics do in a democracy is articulate why something is or is not accurate. And this is just as true if you were looking at something with Puritan rhetoric 600 years ago in England, or Donald Trump's rhetoric from 2 months ago, or a president coming forward in the future who bills himself as an advocate for what is truly true, right? Wherever and whenever you can evaluate something, you may want to look at the accuracy. And then finally, moral standards, or what I prefer to call ethical standards, where you evaluate something based on cultural and social expectations of how it does something good or bad. Now, this is not supposed to be just your own opinion, right? If I, as a rhetorical critic, give all this beautiful evidence and then say, but I hated the speech, so I think it's wrong and bad for them to say that, I lose all credibility, right? I instead need to build ethical and moral standards and talk about why, in a particular context, in a particular society, this is or is not a good thing. Now that we've talked a little bit about those standards, let's take a little bit of practice. Do you know what this is? We're going to take a couple of minutes and I'm going to show you some of these pictures, and I want you to pull up your notes. Pause the video as we go through each of these. I'll give you a moment, but go ahead and pull up a notebook or someplace where you can take notes. And I want you to start by describing what you see here. It's metal, it's maybe stainless steel, but it's got some rust on it. It looks like heavy gauge wire. it's seated on a paper towel. But go into as much detail as possible on describing this thing. I'll pause the video for just a minute. All right, up next, interpret a little bit. Take a minute and think, based on your description, what could you say this might be used for? So look at your description, what evidence have you put there, and write down some interpretations for what its use might be. And next, how well do you think this works? Let's evaluate it based on its functionality, or what we might call its effectiveness standard. How well do you think this works? Take another minute and write down your notes. Now let's jump to another one. What is this? Take a moment and describe in as great detail as possible what you see. Next, go ahead and make some interpretive claims. Remember, interpretation must be based on what you already wrote in the description. Pause the video and make some interpretive claims based on the evidence from your description. And then finally, how well do you think this thing worked at the purpose you have articulated for it? Again, using effectiveness standards, how well did this work? And let's add one more effectiveness standard, let's add one more evaluative standard here. Tell me about its artistic value. Does it have artistic value within the context and purpose you've interpreted for it? And finally, let's take a look at this one. Go ahead and describe this. What is it? Next, let's do one more piece of interpretation. Tell me, based on the evidence in your description, what is this thing used for? And finally, let's take a look at its moral interpretation. Is this good or bad based on the interpretation you've designed for it? All right, my friends, we are going to end our class or our video lecture there. Please bring these notes to class. We're going to talk about them a little bit as a group. Thank you so much, everybody, and I can't wait to see you there.